July 24th, 1943. 22,000 feet above the North Sea, the cockpit of a short Stirling rattles with the drone of 4 Bristol Hercules engines. Inside, the wireless operator glances at his watch, counts down the final seconds, then reaches for a cardboard box stacked by his knee. Inside it, thousands of strips of blackened paper backed with aluminium foil, each one cut to a precise length of 26.5 centimeters. He opens the flare chute and, on the signal, begins posting the strips out into the slipstream, one bundle every minute, like a man feeding confetti into a hurricane. Somewhere below, in a darkened bunker outside Hamburg, a German radar operator watches his screen fill with light. Where moments ago there had been a handful of distinct blips, now there are hundreds, then thousands, an impossible storm of returning echoes that makes no sense against anything his training has taught him. He cannot tell a 4-engined Lancaster from a puff of foil. He cannot tell one aircraft from 1,000. The sky, as far as his instruments are concerned, has simply broken. This is the opening night of Operation Gomorrah, the Royal Air Force's assault on Hamburg, and the strips of foil falling silently through the darkness carry a code name that sounds almost domestic: window. It is not a weapon in the conventional sense. It carries no explosive, no incendiary charge, nothing that could kill a man directly, and yet on this night it will do something that high explosive alone never could. It will make 791 bombers all but invisible to the most sophisticated air defense system in the world, and in doing so it will cut British losses to a fraction of what they had been only weeks before. What makes this moment remarkable is not simply the cleverness of the device, though it is clever. It is the fact that this technology had sat ready and tested in a drawer at the telecommunications research establishment for the best part of a year, deliberately withheld by men in Whitehall terrified of what would happen the day the Germans worked out how it worked and turned it back against London. The story of Window is a story about a weapon almost too simple to believe, and a decision almost too agonizing to make. To understand why a few thousand strips of foil could matter so much, you first have to understand the scale of the catastrophe Bomber Command was living through by the spring of 1943. The bombing campaign against Germany had begun the war with a comforting illusion that bombers, flying in formation, could defend themselves well enough against fighters to get through largely unmolested. That illusion had been bombed out of existence over Germany within the first 2 years of the war. By 1942, RAF Bomber Command was suffering losses that, projected across a typical 30-operation tour, meant the statistical likelihood of a bomber crew surviving to the end of it was something close to a coin flip, and on the worst nights, considerably worse than that. The reason was a layered, deeply organized system of German night air defense known as the Kammhuber Line, named for the Luftwaffe general who built it. Stretching from Denmark down through the Low Countries, it carved the sky into a grid of boxes, each one perhaps 30 kilometers across, each one assigned its own radar station and its own night fighter, orbiting on a radio beacon, waiting. A long-range early warning radar called Freya would detect a bomber stream from up to 100 kilometers out. As individual aircraft entered a box, a more precise radar called Würzburg would lock onto first the intruder, then the defending night fighter, feeding continuous position data to a ground controller who would talk the fighter onto the bomber's tail with an intimacy that felt, to the crews on the receiving end, almost personal. Once within a few hundred meters, the night fighter's own onboard radar, Liechtenstein, would take over for the final, lethal approach. It was an assembly line for shooting down airplanes, and it worked with horrifying efficiency. Bomber crews flying over the Reich described it as flying through a corridor with doors that opened only to let a fighter through, then closed again behind them. There was no real evasive maneuver against a system this methodical, because the system did not rely on a single roll of the dice. It relied on continuous tracking, box after box, the whole length of the journey in and the whole length of the journey home. Throwing more bombers at Germany simply meant feeding more aircraft into a machine precisely calibrated to consume them. British scientists had known about the gap in German radar coverage that foil strips could exploit since as early as 1937, when researchers first noticed that aluminium strips cut to roughly half the wavelength of a given radar set would resonate with that signal and throw back an echo many times larger than their physical size would suggest. By 1942, the principle had a name, window, and a thoroughly tested operational plan. Trials showed that a modest quantity of strips dropped from a single aircraft could replicate dozens or even hundreds of false returns on a Würzburg screen. The problem was never scientific. The problem was political, and it went all the way to the top. The fear, articulated most forcefully by the scientist and government advisor Frederick Lindemann, Lord Cherwell, and shared by Winston Churchill himself, was elegantly simple and utterly paralyzing. Britain knew the principle worked because British radar was vulnerable to exactly the same trick. RAF Fighter Command's own defensive radar network, the very system that had helped win the Battle of Britain, would be just as blind to a German bomber dropping foil as a German radar set would be to an RAF bomber doing the same. To use window was to hand the enemy the design for a skeleton key to every lock in the country, at a moment when London was already enduring the early V-weapon scares and German bombing remained a live threat, however diminished from the Blitz. For more than a year, the device that could have saved hundreds of bomber crews sat in a filing cabinet while the casualty lists grew longer. The instrument itself, when it was finally released for use, could hardly have been more unassuming. Each strip of window was a length of black paper, laminated on one side with aluminium foil, cut to a standard size of approximately 26.5 centimeters by 1.5 centimeters, a dimension chosen deliberately to resonate with the wavelength used by German Würzburg radar sets, which operated around the 53-centimeter band. The physics is the same principle that makes a wine glass shatter at a particular musical note. An object of the right size, struck by a wave of the right frequency, will resonate and re-radiate that energy with startling efficiency. A strip of foil weighing barely a gram could, under the right conditions, produce a radar echo comparable to that of an entire aircraft. Production was handled with a deliberate, almost theatrical ordinariness. Contracts were let to paper and stationery firms across Britain, with workers told only that they were cutting foil-backed paper to a government specification, with no explanation of what it was for. Millions upon millions of strips were produced, packed into bundles, and loaded aboard bombers in cardboard containers not unlike grocery boxes. A single Lancaster on a major raid might carry several hundred such bundles, to be posted out through the flare chute or, in aircraft fitted for the purpose, dispensed automatically at timed intervals throughout the approach to the target. The rate of release mattered enormously. Dropped too slowly, the strips would form a thin, unconvincing trickle on enemy screens. Dropped at the correct rate, roughly one bundle of around 2,000 strips released every minute, they would create a continuously expanding cloud of false echoes that moved through the sky at the same speed as the bomber stream itself, mimicking not just the presence of aircraft, but their motion, their direction, their apparent number. When window was finally authorized, in the days immediately before the Hamburg raids, the effect on German defenses was close to total collapse. Würzburg radar screens that had previously shown a handful of crisp, trackable returns now showed an undifferentiated blizzard. Ground controllers, trained for years to read individual aircraft tracks and talk fighters onto them with precision, found themselves reading static. Night fighter pilots orbiting their beacons received garbled, contradictory instructions, or none at all, as controllers simply lost the ability to distinguish a genuine target from a phantom. Searchlight batteries, which by this stage of the war were largely radar-directed, wavered uselessly across empty sky or fixed on chaff clouds drifting on the wind. The famous Kammhuber line, the product of years of careful engineering and organization, was rendered, in a single night, almost entirely deaf and blind. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more to come about how Germany scrambled to answer this and very nearly succeeded. The human accounts from that first Hamburg raid carry a particular flavor of disbelief. German night fighter crews later described a sensation of flying through a sky gone mad, of receiving fix after contradictory fix from the ground, of seeing their own onboard Liechtenstein radar sets fill with the same false echoes plaguing the ground stations, rendering airborne interception nearly as difficult as ground-controlled interception had become. RAF loss rates for the 4 major raids that made up Operation Gomorrah fell dramatically compared to recent operations over similarly defended targets, and aircrew who had grown accustomed to the German defenses picking them off methodically, box by box, found instead a comparatively clear run to the target and back. It must be said plainly that window did not make bombing safe. Flak guns, which used a different method of detection less affected by chaff, continued to take a toll, and the Firestorm Bomber Command and the United States Army Air Forces created over Hamburg across that week killed an estimated 34,000 civilians on the ground, a fact that sits uneasily, and rightly so, alongside any account of the raid's tactical success. But for the bomber crews themselves, the immediate, measurable change in their odds of survival was real, and it was sudden, and it was down almost entirely to a few thousand strips of blackened foil. The German response, once the shock wore off, was rapid and resourceful. Engineers and physicists, principal among them a young officer named Wolfgang Martini's technical staff, raced to develop replacement systems less vulnerable to chaff, including more sophisticated radar processing and, eventually, a new tactic abandoning the rigid box system altogether in favor of a freer, less structured form of interception nicknamed Zame Sao, or tame bore, in which night fighters were fed directly into the bomber stream itself and allowed to hunt visually and electronically without rigid sector control. Germany also developed and deployed its own version of chaff, called Düppel, after the village near Berlin where early trials had taken place, though Hitler had personally forbidden its use for offensive purposes for fear of provoking exactly the British response that Lindemann had feared in reverse. The irony was almost perfect. Both sides held the same key to the same lock, and both held off using it out of fear the other would use it back until events forced Britain's hand first. The Americans, flying daylight raids with the 8th Air Force, adopted window more cautiously and somewhat later, partly because daylight formations relied less heavily on the kind of precision ground-controlled interception that chaff disrupted most effectively, and partly because American doctrine placed greater faith in defensive firepower and tight formation flying than in electronic deception. When American forces did adopt chaff dispensing in quantity, later in 1943 and into 1944, they found it useful chiefly against German flak radar rather than against fighter control, since daylight visual interception was naturally less susceptible to a trick built around radar returns alone. The British approach, refined through nearly a year of suppressed but rigorous testing before Hamburg, remained for some time the more sophisticated and more comprehensively integrated use of the principle, woven into bomber stream tactics, release timing, and even feint raids designed to make chaff clouds simulate entire phantom formations heading for different targets altogether. The longer legacy of Window is, in some ways, more significant than its dramatic debut. It marked one of the first large-scale demonstrations that an electronic countermeasure, cheap, simple, and almost laughably low technology compared to the radar systems it defeated, could neutralize an enormous and expensive defensive infrastructure built over years. That lesson did not disappear with the war. The principle of chaff remains in use by military aircraft and ships to this day, now dispensed from cartridges rather than cardboard boxes, defending against radar-guided missiles rather than Würzburg-controlled night fighters, but resting on exactly the same physics that a handful of British scientists worked out watching strips of foil flutter in a wind tunnel years before Hamburg burned. Examples of original window strips, along with the dispensers used to release them, can today be seen in the collections of the Royal Air Force Museum and the Imperial War Museum, Unassuming little objects, easy to overlook in a display case full of guns and engines, that nonetheless changed the entire character of the air war over Europe within the space of a single night. What lingers from the story of Window is the strangeness of its power. There is something almost unsettling about a weapon that contains no explosive, fires no round, and yet which, on the night it was finally permitted to be used, did more to protect the lives of British aircrew than almost any single piece of armor or armament fitted to their aircraft. It worked not by destroying anything but by inserting confusion into a system that depended entirely on certainty, and in doing so it exposed a truth that would shape the rest of the century's conflicts, that the side which controls information, and the side which can deny that information to its enemy, often holds an advantage that no quantity of guns or armor can match. Picture, once more, that Stirling above the North Sea, the wireless operator feeding strip after strip of foil into the dark. He cannot see what is happening on the ground. He has no way of knowing, in that moment, that he is watching the collapse of one of the most formidable defensive networks ever built, accomplished with nothing more than paper, glue, and a thin skin of aluminium. He only knows that the box at his feet is emptying, minute by minute, bundle by bundle, and that somewhere below, in the dark, a system built to find him is, for the first time in a long while, lost. The strips drift down through the night, catching what little light there is, and the sky that had hunted bombers so methodically for years simply stops making sense. No armor plate did that. No engine upgrade did that. A few thousand pieces of foil, falling like black snow, did that, and in doing so they bought time and lives, and proved that sometimes the deadliest trick in the sky is the one that looks, from a distance, like nothing at all.